Okay, so here we go. Final lecture on Malinowski's Crime and Custom. Um, Having already addressed a couple of cases of sorcery and suicide in previous chapters, we saw this, for example, with the example of the young man who threw himself from a tree to commit suicide after his illicit relationship with his first cousin was made public, and there was some ineffective black magic used in that case. In that the suitor of the girl involved tried to use black magic to to bring misfortune upon the boy who ultimately killed himself. In any case, it's come up in a couple of other examples, so now he wants to turn his attention to it more directly. It is an exclusively male domain, he says, so that there are some men who will have particularly high intelligence and who he describes as sort of like charismatic figures, but there are few of them. This is not the purview of a large proportion of the male population. There are specialists, and they acquire their skills, he says, or they acquire their art by learning particular spells and submitting to certain conditions. He doesn't list what those conditions are, so it's not entirely clear if they're conditions of apprenticeship or if they're particular social arrangements. But nonetheless, they become recognized within the community as experts in their field. Now, one of the things that he points out is that although they may use magic, sorcery on their own behalf, they're also available for hire. And this brings out a particular contrast that Durkheim makes when he's contrasting religion and magic or sorcery. In that, he says that a religion will have a congregation. That's what constitutes it as a religion. A magician or a sorcerer, on the other hand, will have clients, a clientele. This is, I think, the kind of point that Malinowski is bringing to the surface here, where he's saying the sorcerers are not going to be religious leaders in any clear sense. They're going to be available for hire. And so they will have clients, usually the more prestigious members of a clan, of Trobriand society more broadly. Now, the reason that their influence is profound is that people believe in black magic. In particular, they think that wherever there is a case of death or of severe illness, so not just small accidents, I think, but significant ailments, there's a suspicion of black magic, and so of course Trobriand Islanders are going to want to know who was the sorcerer in any case, who hired the sorcerer in any case of severe illness or of death. Sorcery then will give a man a fair, an unusual amount, or an uncommon amount of power, wealth, and influence, and that might tempt him to abuse his power. But on the whole, Malinowski says, in fact, sorcerers are restrained. Why? Because it could be costly to them to abuse their position. He says, Malinowski does, not infrequently one sorcerer is believed to be put away by another on behalf of a chief or on the chief's orders. So then, if a sorcerer seems to be getting too powerful or too flagrant with his use of sorcery of black magic, there are other sorcerers around. It could be very costly to him. It could cost him his health or even his life. On the other hand, though, should a sorcerer operate in the service of what is widely perceived to be the correction of an injustice, or in the case of an illegal act, then public sentiment will not turn against him, it will be behind him. And in those cases, a sorcerer will be quite happy to receive his full fee for his services. But there's more. This is where sorcery takes on its particular legal dimension for Malinowski. In cases where a victim learns that a sorcerer is at work against him, that individual may very well, out of fear, make amends or come to an equitable arrangement with another party. Thus, ordinarily, black magic acts as a genuine legal force, he says, because it's used in carrying out the rules of tribal law. It prevents the use of violence and it restores equilibrium. Given the conviction that death implies black magic, Malinowski devotes several pages to the exhumation and interpretation of corpses shortly after death. So this has been a common practice in the Trobriand Islands, where upon dying, the corpse will be interred, but for a short period, and then will be exhumed, and people will gather around to interpret what they see on the corpse, to interpret the posture of the corpse, expressions on the corpse. If things like if there's particular leakage from the nose, these will be interpreted as signs, not of exactly what it was that killed the individual, but what particular trait the individual exhibited that that brought about jealousy, perhaps, a revenge motive, perhaps, on the part of another, so that that person would use sorcery against this individual. Now, this is a practice, he says, that was quite common until British colonialism. During the colonial era, the colonial power disapproved of it, and so it sort of got pushed to the fringes, to smaller villages where colonial authority was less present. But this interpretation of the signs of the body was something that Trobriand Islanders would practice as a way of discerning not biological causes of death, but black magical causes of death. And so, again, we can see that what this points toward is the sense that if someone stands out for particular reasons, is too successful at attracting lovers, is too successful a gardener or a fisher, or is too attractive, or is in some way threatening to the chief, or whatever sort of exceptional trait the individual may have that could provoke jealousy or the wish for revenge on someone's part. These are the kinds of things that would incite someone to hire a sorcerer against that individual. And so this is why it's relevant to interpret, for Trobriand Islanders that is, why it's relevant to interpret these signs so that they can figure out, at least in principle, figure out who it was who stood in a position to wish this person ill. Of course, not surprisingly, there will be disputes about how to interpret the signs. Malinowski says there are great disagreements over what the body is revealing. Nonetheless, the point that he wants to make is that this interpretation does occur, and it reveals the sensibilities around how black magic can be employed in a particular individual's death. This idea that undue prominence can provoke black magic brings us to the role of the chief. So the chief is to enforce what Malinowski refers to as the golden mean, this kind of equilibrium among commoners, so that it's fine for the chief to stand out, it's fine for sorcerers to stand out as having particular gifts and particular status. But on the whole, there must be less variation between commoners so that there's not this provocation of jealousy. Black magic, then, Malinowski says, is his principal instrument in the enforcement of his exclusive privileges and prerogatives, and as, on the whole, a tool for stronger to use against weaker. In this way, then, black magic tends to work in the service of the status quo. Now, Malinowski makes two concluding points about sorcery. First, it's legally ambiguous, right? Because it can serve legal but also criminal ends. As we saw with the suitor who tried to employ black magic to bring about misfortune upon his rival, his incestuous, the rival who's engaged in an incestuous relationship with his cousin. Secondly, it belongs in the realm of the criminal. That is, it's typically not a matter of dealing with the kind of civil law issues that Malinowski spends the first part of the book talking about. Those things around mutual obligation, give and take, things like that. So it's not about penalty, it's about punishment. And it's about punishment for the exceptional, not the ordinary event. Next, Malinowski turns to suicide, saying that it too has a place in the legal life of Melanesians, typically, though, as a response to a situation that offers no out for an accused person. He takes, as an example, the case of Bomawaku. Now, there will be features of this story that are similar to the one that we heard in a previous chapter. And indeed, Malinowski says that it's in the context of the young men jumping from the tree to commit suicide that another person tells him of this story. So Bomawaku had an official and acceptable suitor, but she was in love with a boy in her own clan. Again, Malinowski has said that this happens from time to time. It's not in line with the principle of exogamy, but it happens, and it is, for the most part, largely tolerated if done in a discreet kind of a way. Okay, but problems ensue. Why? Because the suitor learns of her love for a boy in her clan, and he makes this public. He insults her publicly so that now she's faced with this crisis for which suicide is the resolution. Malinowski's point, then, is that the real cause of the suicide was not the illicit nature of the affair, but rather the publication of that affair, the insult that her would-be suitor launched against her. So he says, two motives must be registered in the psychology of suicide. First, there is always some sin, crime, or passionate outburst to expiate, like the violation of the exogamy rule. Secondly, there is a protest against those who have brought this trespass to light, insulted the culprit in public, forced him into an unbearable situation for which suicide is the only out. Suicide then doesn't serve justice, but it offers the accused a means of escape and rehabilitation, say, of his or her reputation, with a similar rule to sorcery. Malinowski says of it, "It looms large in the psychology of the natives, is a permanent damper on any violence of language or behavior, on any deviation from custom or tradition, which might hurt or offend another. Thus, suicide, like sorcery, is a means of keeping the natives to the strict observance of the law, a means of preventing people from extreme and unusual types of behavior. Both are pronounced conservative influences, and as such are strong supports of law and order." The lessons Malinowski has taken on crime and punishment among Torbreant Islanders is that, as clear and well known as violations may be, he does say that, to take the example of exogamy, there are plenty, he doesn't say plenty, he says that violations occur and are largely tolerated as long as the two individuals are not too closely related. So, even though violations occur and are well known, the principles of punishment are vague, the methods of retribution are fitful and not governed by any fixed institution, so that there's no sort of set of legal institutions organized around the idea of punishment of crime. Hence, non-legal means like suicide, sorcery, magic, the chief's power, or supernatural consequences of taboo are most common, as ill-suited as they are to serving justice. So then we may remember that, say in the case of the violation of an incest taboo, that there's also a magical remedy that is taken to be entirely efficacious, if it's done properly, to remove the supernatural impact of that violation for the other members of the clan. He's just said then that there's not this kind of single institutional presence of law, but rather that it has this kind of haphazard feel to it. So then, rather than a single principle or institution, now, I was just saying that rather than having a single principle or institution organizing law in the Torbreant Islands, Malinowski claims that there are multiple, more or less independent systems that are not perfectly adjusted to one another. I was saying that, and my computer glitched. But now I'm back, so I can carry on from that point. He takes as his examples here mother right and father love as drawing a man in two directions simultaneously in relation to his sister's son and to his own son, right? So these are not wedded under a single system. These are two systems that can be in conflict with one another. His matrilineal nephew, so his sister's son, stands in a specific relationship to the man, his nearest kinsman and the heir to all of his dignities and offices. His son, by contrast, is not legally his kinsman. Rather, his son belongs to his mother's kin, right? Because it's a matrilineal society. It measures descent through the mother's line, not through the father's line, not bilaterally, only through the mother's line. So, his son, his mother's kin, so that the father's only bond is through the relation of marriage to the son's mother. So we can recall this set of relationships that we looked at before, where we have the relationship, the avuncular relationship of the mother's brother to the son. So the maternal nephew. That's a relationship that we've looked at in the past. Okay, but now we add a new relationship. So now the man is married, has a child, a son, but not all of these relationships have a legal status. So this is a legal status, a relationship of marriage. This is has a legal status. The mother-son relation. Uncle-nephew relationship through his sister. That's a legal relationship. Also, brother-sister relationship. You may remember from a previous lecture when we talked about how it is the brother's responsibility to supply his sister's house with, for example, yams. Okay, so legal obligation. That was a civil legal obligation, but nonetheless, legal relationship. Another marriage, again, a legal relationship. The trick is, though, that this father-son is not a legal relationship. It has no legal status. Similarly, father-son, not a legal relationship. As a legal matter, then, the father-son relationship has no standing. Malinowski doesn't talk about this with respect to daughters, while the avuncular relationship, the relationship of uncle and nephew through the uncle-sister, that relationship does. In fact, though, the way that things work out is that the father is typically more attached to his biological son than he is to his legal kinsman, his sister's son. In principle, then, the law of mother right prevails over the significantly weaker father love, except in uncommon circumstances. So if it's the chief who's at issue, his power may have this kind of balancing effect so that his son may have an equal position to that of his nephew. But even then, in cases of conflict between son and nephew, the rights of the nephew's kin will take precedence over the chief's preference for his son. So Malinowski recites an example of this on page 102 to 104, in which the chief's sons get into a conflict with the chief's nephews through his sister, and he has a preference for his sons. He loves his sons. But once the kinspeople of his nephews start to make these sort of ritualized calls and hurl ritualized insults at his sons, he has no choice. He can't side with his sons anymore because those kinspeople are his kinspeople as well, while his sons are not. And we saw earlier examples where there is a difference, between principle and practice. So that when you have a boy who's an infant, who's cared for by his mother, but in the father's village, right? Because again, it's a matrilineal society tracing heritage through the mother's line, but it's a patrilocal society, meaning that when a couple weds, the wife moves to the husband's village, right? Patrilocal. Okay, so the mother and the boy, who's legally related to her, are in the father's village. The father then, naturally enough, plays this role of guardian and protector of both her and the son until the boy hits puberty. Then he'll go to live in his mother's village. Why? Because that's where his kinship lineage resides, and that's why he will fall under the tutelage of his uncle there, his sister's brother. This might not align with the father's wishes, though. It might not align with the boy's wishes as well. And so there are possible arrangements that allow the son to remain with his mother and father after puberty. They're only at very best quasi-legal, though. For example, then, Malinowski says, the accredited pretext that the son remains there to be able better to fill his father's yam house, which he does in the name of his mother's brother as his successor. Why? Because, again, his uncle has the responsibility of providing yams to his sister and his sister's son. So if the son, who will be the successor of his uncle, is involved in staying in the village to provide yams, then that's sufficient pretext for him to stay in that village rather than in his mother's village. Malinowski explains further how the institution of cross-cousin marriage can facilitate father love within the context of mother rights. So cross-cousin marriage is, here we have the ego, who in this case is male, it's a boy, and the cross-cousin will be either the father's sister's daughter, right? So cross-cousin being father's sister, or mother's brother's daughter. So parallel would be the opposite, father's brother's child or mother's sister's child. So the standard in the Trobriand Islands is cross-cousin marriage. So this can provide a particular circumstance. Now, it's a fairly long section, so I will read it from the book rather than reproducing it here. It's on pages 110 to 111. He's explaining then how, under unique circumstances, cross-cousin marriage can be exploited to allow the boy to remain in the village of his father. Malinowski says, the most important arrangement by which a temporary father line is smuggled into mother right is the institution of cross-cousin marriage. A man in the Trobriands who has a son and whose sister gives birth to a girl has the right to ask that this infant be betrothed to his son. Thus, his grandchild will be of his own kin, and his son will become the brother-in-law of the heir to chieftainship. This latter will, therefore, be under an obligation to supply the son's household with food, and in general, to be a helpmate to his brother-in-law and protector of his sister's family. Thus, the very man on whose interest the son is likely to encroach is prevented from resenting it, and indeed, made to regard it as his own privilege. Cross-cousin marriage in the Trobriands is an institution by which a man can secure for his son a definite, though roundabout, right to remain for life in the father's community through an exceptional matrilocal marriage and enjoy almost all the privileges of full citizenship. Okay, now, Malinowski in this final chapter comes back to a theme that has bubbled to the surface here and there throughout the piece, throughout the whole book. The presumption of clan unity that lies at the heart of anthropological work among his contemporaries, right? So he's saying that his contemporaries in anthropology have sort of been taken by this idea of clan unity. In his view, though, it lacks the descriptive coherence and explanatory force that his contemporaries would wish it to have. Why? Because, as he's shown, at the core of the clan, there's not unity, but rather a fissure between father and uncle. That is to say that his fellow anthropologists were, to quote him, mistaking the legal ideal for the sociological realities of tribal life. He does accept mother right as the exclusive principle of kinship, does provide to Trobriand Islanders a coherent way of organizing who counts as kin and who does not, how that generates a classificatory kinship system that, to a limited extent, governs legal relations, and is associated with the totemic system of clans and subclans, which has further legal implications, including, first, the fact of common clan and subclan name. Second, shared responsibilities in vendetta, So that you may remember then when in the first case of suicide, the boy puts on a particular costume, climbs up the tree, launches a veiled accusation at the suitor who would have, the suitor who called out his violation of the incest taboo, which is why he is now going to leap to his death. His kinsmen have to take on the vendetta on his behalf after he kills himself, which is why the fight breaks out at the funeral immediately after he dies, with the clanspeople of the suitor of his lover. Okay, so shared responsibilities in vendetta is then a legal responsibility. Third, the rule of exogamy, the very one that the boy violated. And fourth, the fiction of an overweening interest in one another's welfare, so that by a death, the sub-clan first, and to some extent the clan, are considered bereft, and the whole mourning ritual is tuned to this traditional view. In sum, then, there are several real, shared, common interests that unite members of the subclan and component subclans into a clan. So Malinowski's point is not that these are mistaken, but that they're partial. He doesn't think, then, that that's where analysis should end, because even though ideas about kinship, totemic division, social duties, and so forth emphasize clan dogma, the very clan dogma that is so attractive to anthropologists, sentiments do not always do so. And of course, this goes to how people actually live out their lives. So he says, while in any contest of social, political, or ceremonial nature, a man, through ambition, pride, and patriotism, invariably sides with his matrilineal kindred, softer feelings, loving friendship, attachments, make him often neglect clan for wife, children, and friends in the ordinary situations of life. He's shown this with respect to the elasticity and sometimes evasion of exogamy, or the economic favors a father may show his son, even though those should be shown to his kinspeople, of which his son is not a member. Clans, he explains then, are only homogeneous with respect to other clans. Internally, they're differentiated. And he's explained all of this, for example, with respect to the violation of the exogamy rule, right, where individuals will see sort of this progressive receding of relatedness, and therefore see people who are more allowable, let's say, as candidates for sexual relations, not marriage, but for sexual relations, as they get further away. As they get closer, people see a much different picture, and so immediate biological brother and sister, for example, will be strictly off limits. Okay, carrying on though. Although he recognizes the appeal of formulaic conventions for anthropologists, naturally enough, if we can come up with a nice formulaic convention, we can say this is how things are, this is the way it is, so to speak, written down, then it can feel like our work is done. But he asks us, in a sense, not to settle for them. We have to abandon how definitely the idea of an inert solid crust or cake of custom rigidly pressing from the outside upon the whole structure of tribal life. Law and order arise out of the very processes which they govern, but they are not rigid, nor due to any inertia or permanent mold. They obtain, on the contrary, as the result of a constant struggle, not merely of human passions against the law, but of legal principles with one another. as we've seen then with this fissure at the heart of the clan, and in the case of passions, with the father's sentiments towards the son. So that it's in this context of actual practice that the law makes its appearance. Malinowski concludes first that rather than thinking of law and custom as the same, we have to recognize law as a distinct portion of custom, so that there are customs that are not law, in other words. That it is itself internally divided. So the law has this division into the kind of everyday governance of relations that he calls civil law, where he's talking about exchange between exchange partners, the give and take of everyday life, the mutuality that constitutes everyday relationships on the one hand, and then criminal law on the other hand, as distinct as this sort of law of exceptional events that is also internally inconsistent. Why? Because there are different systems of law that are at times in competition with one another. He makes a final methodological point. He says, the true problem is not to study how human life submits to rules. It simply does not. The real problem is how the rules become adapted to life. The methodological demand, then, is to learn this through direct observation, right? So he's making a pitch for long-term fieldwork, what has now become the standard in anthropological work. So a long-term direct observation of how the rules of custom function in actual life. Because what matters, and what's anthropologically interesting, he feels, is not the rules themselves, it's how they are carried out. And that brings us to the end of Crime and Custom in Savage Society by Malinowski. Thank you very much.